Welcome, everyone, to Inclusion Starts Now, the podcast. I have a new person that I met through Vancouver Moms, I think, Facebook group who basically just asked if anyone was doing a podcast. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, I am. And now here we are connecting. And you are pretty much going to hear our first conversation of getting to know each other. So, why not? So Lana, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, so my name's Lana. I am a mom to a toddler, Juniper, and I met Kayla on a Vancouver, Washington moms group, like she said. I recently started a podcast about parenting while autistic, and I reached out to Kayla to see, she said she does a podcast, and it turns out our podcasts are in similar areas of inclusion and autism and that sort of world. And so we thought we would put our heads together and talk and see how we could help cross promote each other's podcasts and support each other in the podcasting journey. My podcast is about parenting when you're autistic. It came about because I started to suspect I'm on the autism spectrum this spring. And part of what led me to that was feeling like parenting is exponentially harder for me than the people I observe around me, and just being baffled by how people can have more than one kid and actually seem to genuinely like it and be thriving. And I'm like barely surviving with a toddler and working part-time. And so then once I started thinking about autism and taking more screenings and doing more research, the more convinced I became that I was autistic, then I wanted to find resources to learn about parenting as someone who's autistic. Because again, one of my autistic traits is that I love to research things and delve into the data. And there was a real dearth of information. I found tons of books and tons of podcasts about raising autistic children, but not about being the autistic parent, which is interesting because a large majority of autistic children have at least one autistic parent because it's so genetic. But
Hmm.
there's just really not that much out there about the experience of being autistic and raising children. So I found, I think, two books and a few episodes on different people's podcasts, but no podcast devoted to it entirely. And so I thought, well, I guess if I can't find one, I'll make one instead. And so I got the idea to start a podcast. And then, in the vein of autism and special interests, when I get really into something, I'm rather obsessed with it and move very quickly. And so I think I went from, I should start a podcast to like publishing my first podcast episode in like a week or something. Like that's all I did was just think about podcasts all week. So it all came about very quickly. And now here we are.
That is so awesome. I love that story so much. I love the name Juniper. That was definitely on our list of names. So you said she's a toddler?
Yeah, she's a year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who is also a parent and trying to run a business on the side, yeah, it is extremely overwhelming and it is very hard to, I mean, just like the regulating of someone else while you're like trying to also regulate yourself is just like really hard. So you were saying that are you saying that like becoming a parent was really when you started thinking like, am I on the spectrum? Like, am I autistic? Or did you ever feel like you had moments before?
No, I did not have any moments before. I've had moments of suspecting family members potentially being autistic, but not myself. I think because of the way that autism presents differently in women.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't even the first year postpartum with Juniper, it didn't cross my mind. It was this spring. I work as a naturopathic doctor, mainly focusing on mental health. And I had a patient who recommended the book Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll read that because I have patients who are autistic and I should understand them better. In school, we really got no training on autism. So I undertook this as a continuing education project for work. And then the more I read, the more I started thinking about family members. And then I started thinking that it was genetic and that I should do some of the screening tests because I wanted to do the screening tests and see how I thought my family members would score. And then the more I started reading the screening tests, the more I was like, oh, some of these things apply to me. And I scored really kind of in the cutoff zone where they're like, you could be neurotypical or you could be autistic. It's hard to tell. And then the more I thought about it, I went back and retook the tests, answering how I would if I wasn't masking. And then I scored really high. So there were questions like,
Oh,
do you avoid eye contact? And I don't avoid eye contact. I think I make pretty normal eye contact, but I don't like making eye contact. If it were up to me, I wouldn't, but I do because I know that's what you're supposed to do. And so
yeah.
I was answering it through this lens of masking. And then I had to go back and reread all the questions and go like, okay, if I'm not intentionally trying to be normal, then what would I
Oh my
do?
gosh. I think that is so interesting because so I have not read Unmasking Autism and I've heard of it and I really want to. I was gonna say the book that changed, like that got me thinking more about autism in women was The Kiss Quotient. It's a fictional book,
Hmm.
but the woman is I'm pretty sure she's autistic. She wrote this book and it's a little spicy. There are some sex scenes in the book, but the main character is a woman and she's autistic and she, like is in relationships. She lives independently. She has a job, but she like has these just social challenges that
Mhm.
have like affected her relationships and like worry her family. And it's just like, it's kind of interesting to see it through a way that, like, if girls are shy in school or something, or they're like, not giving you eye contact or not wanting to play, people are like, oh, yeah, she's just shy. Or like, she
And
just
that
doesn't
was the
talk about
story
it.
when I was a child, was that I am just a shy, cautious person. And I would tend to observe a lot, even as a toddler, before I would join in with other kids. And that was just labeled as shy. And now I'm going back and seeing that through a different lens that likely I was observing, figuring out how do I join this interaction? What's going on here? And how do
Yeah.
I enter this social setting? And so I was watching in order to be able to go in and then copy what the other kids were doing. And I
It-
still do that to a degree, studying other people's interactions to know what I'm supposed to do.
yeah.
And so that being observant wasn't really being shy, it was trying to figure out the social rules.
Yeah. I think that is just such an interesting, I really now want to read that book, but that makes so much sense that because and I feel like so many people kind of dismiss like any sort of possible symptoms or whatever they're seeing in like elementary school. I feel like it just gets dismissed a lot, where it's like, I don't know, they're little, they'll grow out of it or something. And so it's interesting. I feel like how many adults, especially like in our generation, are taking it upon themselves to figure out, like, why is this so hard for me? Like, this doesn't seem hard for you. And to like get these diagnoses. And I think that's like what's so important when people like don't want to think that they're autistic or don't want to like fall into this like disability category. Um, because I mean what people have told me is like they just want to be normal. And I'm like, I mean, first off, I do not like the word normal. I think it's a stupid word. But I do think it's just like a very negative, like, however our brain, like all of our brains work differently. If we can
Mhm.
understand and like connect to other people who are also having the same challenges we are, I feel like that could be really helpful, enlightening. Like, have you met other parents who are autistic and have kids?
Yes, I have gone out of my way to try and meet other autistic parents because after starting to think that I was autistic, I was thinking about my friends and the people that I've been closest with in my life. And they're pretty much all also autistic when I look back. some of them diagnosed and some of them undiagnosed. But I definitely have a type that I gravitate to that I get along well with, and they're a lot like me.
Yeah.
As most of us, tend to get along best with people who are like us. Um, and so part of that process of realizing that I get along best with other autistic people has been maybe I should focus my efforts in making new friends in the autistic community because that's my highest chance of meeting someone that I really get along well with. If
Yeah.
historically all of my good friends have been autistic, I should probably just kind of narrow myself to focus on that pool to increase my chances of success.
Yeah.
Plus, I just feel more comfortable. Like when I've been interviewing guests for my podcast who are also autistic, we can get to the end of the interview and then I can just tell them, this is the part where I never know how to say goodbye. Like that's one of my social things that is really hard, and I have no script for
Yeah.
like how to end a call. At work, I do. I have a script that I use with my patients. It's like I say the same thing every time in exactly the same way because I know that it works.
Yeah.
And for a podcast, I don't have a script yet. So I've had some very awkward, like trying to thank them and then be like, okay, goodbye, I guess. But since they're
Yeah.
also autistic, we can both just laugh and be like, yep, this is one of those awkward social moments where neither of us know how to say goodbye.
Yeah.
And, we can just laugh about it, which is really nice to not have to like scramble and again pretend to be normal, whatever we want to make
Yeah.
normal out to be. The other thing I've noticed, I talked to my mom and my sister once I started suspecting that I might be autistic. And when I brought it up with my sister, she was like, oh, yeah, she's thought that for years, but she didn't bring it up because she thought I would be kind of offended by it. And the same thing, like my mom has wondered before I started wondering. But again, she thought I would be offended. And I really don't feel offended at all if people think that I'm autistic because I am. And to me, it's like, it's not an insult. It's just a description of how my brain works.
Yeah.
And if anything, it's a relief to say, okay, some of these ways that I am different and that things are hard for me that aren't hard for everybody else are founded in neurology. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to like work harder and be different because I've spent my whole life trying to keep up with neurotypical standards. And for the most part, doing it, but running myself into the ground in order to do so. And in a way, it's kind of relieving to say, oh, okay, I fit into this disability world and I need to make my life match with my actual abilities versus with these neurotypical expectations. Because that mismatch between my ability and the expectations I'm putting on myself is what gets you into burnout, is
Yes.
having that chronic mismatch.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I feel like just the masking, I mean, in general, like how many people I feel like must like I guess masking is really what, and this was really after interviewing Chloe. I think I started trying to notice who was like masking, like
Mm-hmm.
who was kind of just showing up to do what they thought they had to do. Um, and I mean, I know I've kind of always had the personality of just like, come as you are. I don't care if you're direct, if you're not looking at me. Like, I've always been, and it could have been just me being a former special ed teacher, but
Mm-hmm.
it definitely led to more interesting relationships where like I was kind of noticing, I guess it just like made me notice it more. So I guess now that you have like this diagnosis, do you feel like you notice it more? Because you were saying that some of your friends are undiagnosed, but do they think that they're autistic?
Yes, my closest friend does suspect that she's autistic, and she actually went for a formal eval and was told that it's more social anxiety. But when she talked through the eval process that they did, it sounded not at all like the thorough eval that I had. So I kind of think the evaluator she went to didn't specialize in adult autism or females
Yeah.
with autism, and that she probably didn't get a very thorough assessment.
Where
Uh,
did you get your eval?
Yeah, I did my eval with Skylar Tharp at Pacific Northwest Relational Therapy. She's local in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And she did a great job. And then I also just interviewed a gal, Kaylee Torres, that also offers autism evals in Vancouver for adults and specializes in working with the BIPOC community and queer communities,
Oh,
which are
awesome.
historically very underdiagnosed in the autism world.
Yeah. That is great because I've had people reach out to me saying that they want to get an eval and I'm like, I have no idea. I have an online test that you can take, but like
Yeah.
that's
Those are the
really
two people I know. Also, actually, Anson Service also does autism evals. He spells his first name Anson.
okay. I'm
He does them
gonna
in Vancouver too. And actually, there's a law going through Congress right now in Washington to try and get it opened up so that naturopaths can do autism evals. So if that
cool.
passes, I'm going to pursue training in it and eventually offer autism evals. But
That
it
would
depends
be
on if that law passes and if I'm, allowed to with my credential type.
yeah, that would be so cool. I'm gonna put all of those names in the show notes so everybody just has them because I feel,
Mhm.
as accommodating as we can be here. So okay, I am gonna go back to parenting. So you said spring. What was happening like during that time with your child, like while parenting, that really made you think, am I autistic?
Well, I think there was a long lead up starting in the fall last year. So last summer I felt like I was doing pretty well and we would go to Battleground Lake and go swimming. I could do multiple outings in a day. Like if we went swimming, I might be able to like swing by the grocery store in the afternoon. And I felt like I was holding it all together. And then sometime in September, that kind of started to shift. And it wasn't until November that I finally went and got labs because I'd been too tired to go to the lab. And they found that I had low thyroid and I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroid, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition. So that whole fall and winter was just really severe fatigue. Difficulty getting out of bed, difficulty working. I cut back my work hours. That's when I think in October was when I started using more childcare because I literally wasn't sure that I could safely take care of my daughter with how tired that I was. So we found a local woman who's a stay-at-home mom, and she takes Juniper at her house and watches her with her son. And she's been a great addition to our family. She's like Juniper's third parent now.
Yeah.
So that was a really good move in October to get some more childcare help. And then getting on thyroid medication definitely helped with energy. But I've gone through periods of fatigue my whole life that are abnormal. Like I don't see other people struggling with fatigue episodically the same way that I do. And there have been various medical diagnoses over the years that like maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but nothing has really actually explained it or gotten to the bottom of it. And so that was part of what led into this wondering about autism. When I started reading more about autism and autistic burnout, I was like, oh, this would explain periods of really debilitating fatigue where physically everything is fine. Like nobody can find anything wrong.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've been looking, at the fatigue aspect through that burnout lens, and it makes a lot more sense. And I think that's a cumulative load. Since Juniper was born, everything changing was hard. I don't like changes in
Yeah.
my routine, and kids change your routine drastically.
And they also don't care about your
They
routine
don't care about your
at all.
routine.
So I think
And
it
as
was
soon as
very
I
rude.
get into a routine with her, it changes. So, maybe for a month, like nap is at the same time, but then she gets a little older and we switch and we're not doing two naps. Now we're doing one nap. The foods that she like changes. Everything's just constantly shifting. And there's a lot more sensory input with kids. The sound, the smells, the strange textures. There's just a lot more sensory load. And so I think that really took a year and a half to accumulate to the point where I was really burnt out and run down. And
Yeah.
that's part of what led to looking into autism was like something has to give, and I don't know what it is. And I don't want to wait until I have another autoimmune condition to find out.
Yeah.
And my thought with the autoimmune condition, honestly, is I think that it's because of autism and the burnout and the stress that led to developing Hashimoto's. And that if I keep trying to live up to a neurotypical standard, I will just keep getting sicker because my
Yeah.
body literally can't do it.
So what accommodations have you made for yourself?
Oh, that's a great question. I have quite a few I've made or am in the process of making, and I'm still looking for more. Um, a big accommodation was with childcare. I think I have equated being a good parent with spending a lot of time with my daughter, as though, quantity is what counts versus quality. And I'm changing that paradigm. She's going to a lot more childcare. And I'm basically pretending that I work full time and that she needs 5 days a week of full time childcare, even though I work 2 days a week, because living life in a non autistic world is my other half-time job. Like, I just need that much time to recover from the basic demands of life. Um, and I initially had seen that as a temporary accommodation that, like, I'm going to do this while I get out of burnout. But now I'm seeing it as a long-term accommodation that if I do it to get out of burnout and then I go right back to what I was doing before, I'm just going to go back into being burnt out. And
Yeah.
so realistically, until she's a little older, maybe in a different stage of childhood, I need a lot of parenting help. And maybe when she's 5, I'll feel differently. But right now she needs me for everything, and
Yeah.
I can't.
Oh
Um,
yeah, it's definitely exhausting.
yeah.
And I definitely agree that the quality is so much more important than the quantity. Most of my friends are full-time parents, like both full-time parents. They both parents work full-time. And I know that they feel really guilty about it. And I've told them so many times, I'm like, it does not matter that both of you are working full time. What does matter is when you are with your child, that you are like having quality time with them, like that
Hmm.
they don't come back to the house and you're like sitting on your phone ignoring them or like
Yep.
um, going out and just like not choosing to ever be with them. Like that relationship is so important, but it doesn't have to be all the time because yeah, there's definitely times where I have two kids. Um, they are 4 and 2.5, so they are very little and very needy. And um, there's definitely times where I mean, I get burnt out as a mom, and it's definitely like to my partner, I'm like, you need to be with them so I can go like just
Yep.
be like I need to recharge for like 10 minutes by myself, or I'm gonna just like go for a walk somewhere.
Yep.
And I think it's so important to like know when you're having those feelings because parenting is so hard, but then also trying to like I mean, be autistic in a non-autistic world is,
Mhm.
okay, so I was actually having this conversation recently, and I would love to hear your opinion about it. It was at my book club, and people were talking about like, why is it called neurodivergent and neurotypical when it feels like more people are neurodivergent, and like masking? Like, do you think there's actually more neurotypical, or we as a society are just saying that like this is what you're supposed to be, even though the majority of us are neurodivergent? What do you think about
That's
that?
a great question. I had this debate with a patient recently because I was telling him I'm 99% sure he's autistic. And he was like, but all of my friends are either autistic or have ADHD. And so probably it's just overdiagnosed. And my hypothesis is that the majority of people actually are neurotypical. If you look at pretty extensive research, that is what the data would show, but that neurodivergent people tend to clump together. And so if I looked in my life from my perspective, it does look like most people are neurodivergent because I'm neurodivergent and I surround myself with other neurodivergent people. And then say if I ask some family members who are neurotypical, they would say everyone they know is neurotypical except for me. because they're neurotypical and they surround themselves with other neurotypical people because that's who they get along best with. And so I think we end up getting segregated into pockets where, from a neurodivergent person's perspective, it looks like everyone's neurodivergent because that's who you're surrounded with in your community.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. I'm
That's
gonna
my
do,
hypothesis because I have run into
yeah.
that where people who are neurodivergent are like, oh, everyone is. But then I talk
Yeah.
to people who aren't, and they're like, I don't know anyone else who's neurodivergent.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I I mean I don't identify as neurodivergent unless you totally think differently. But I do know I have I mean I would actually say I have like a pretty 50-50 uh division, I don't know, population where like I do have a
Hmm.
lot of neurodivergent friends and I do have friends who just don't identify as neurodivergent. I've learned not to try to diagnose my friends. Nobody really likes it, but it's kind of interesting. I don't know, man. I feel like I really need to think about that because
Yeah.
I I do know, and I mean, like I was kind of saying before, I've always had the personality where when someone has a harder time like kind of fitting in socially, I seem to like kind of take them under my wing. And if I meet someone else who's like me, who's like social and extroverted and talks a lot, I'm usually like, "Well, it's too much. You're already here talking to everyone. You don't need me to." But then I'm really good at making a bunch of friends who don't always like, they have a hard time getting along with each other because they all have these like little social quirks and it makes
You
it a little
collect an
challenging.
eccentric group.
So it's interesting. I really want to, and if any of my friends are listening, I would love your opinions because this is like really interesting. I guess I've never thought of it like that. And
One thing that
I
I found
would
interesting in
work with
another
it.
podcast I was listening to was a common myth about autism that we picture autistic people being quiet and not very talkative, having a hard time joining the conversation, tending to come across as shy, and that really the diagnostic criteria is with social reciprocity. And so
Mhm.
that could be not reciprocating and being quiet and shy, or it could be oversharing and actually being kind of indiscriminate in who you approach and share information with. And
Yeah,
that was something in my diagnostic process. I initially thought there's no way I could be autistic because I do come across as very extroverted. I can talk a lot. I can monopolize a conversation if I'm not careful. And I tend to not be very private. I will share quite a bit with people. And then I listened to this episode about kind of being non-discriminate in who you talk to and who you share with. And that really resonated that from a neurotypical person's perspective, I have had people give me feedback like, maybe you shouldn't share that with this person, sort of sharing in an inappropriate social setting where
yeah,
I don't pick up on the social cues that, like, this is not the right time to share this sort of information. And that
yeah,
that's also an issue with social reciprocity, just not the quiet, withdrawn kind.
yeah. Yeah, that I mean, I would be interested in so like a lot of my teaching with children, it of course we talk a lot about like social cues and social norms. It was like all my students had autism or are autistic.
Mhm.
And so most of them came like I would get a curriculum to talk about social norms and social cues, but I felt like so much of that was like I just feel like it okay. Now I'm going to even talk more. So when I specialized in the deaf blind field, there were so many practices that we did in that field because people who are deaf blind, I mean, it's a very small population. Um,
Mhm.
but there were so many practices specific to the deaf blind population that I was like, no, this is so beneficial for like every child learning.
Mhm.
And so then being a special ed teacher, there was like a lot of things that I did there that I was like, I think just the public needs this information. Like, I don't think a lot of people know about social cues. I mean, I like how often am I out and, someone's just like yelling at someone randomly. And I'm like, we couldn't think of a better way to communicate our needs here. Like,
Hmm.
I guess I'm like trying to, I mean, I guess this kind of goes back to the conversation of like, are there more people who like what makes you neurotypical? Like how would you explain not reading social cues to somebody who thinks that they are doing it well?
Well, that's part of the dilemma. And I had to do this when I was doing my assessment for autism. I had to ask people close to me because I think that I'm reading the social cues well, and I'm not. And part of the autistic brain is that I just don't get it to the degree that I don't even realize that I'm missing it.
Yeah.
So, for instance, like I asked my mom, and she said, well, when people come over to visit me, I don't greet them. Like, I don't tend to stop what I'm doing to say, like, hello, welcome, come on in. And when they're leaving, I don't like stop what I'm doing to be like, oh, I'm so glad you came, give them a hug, say goodbye. And once she said that, I realized, oh, yeah, that's true because I'm
Yeah.
busy doing what I'm doing, and task switching is really hard for me. And so I'm not going to like interrupt what I'm doing to like drop everything and run over and say hi, unless
Yeah.
it's someone I like haven't seen in a long time. But like if my mom stops by to drop something off, I'm going to finish what I'm doing. And I wouldn't even notice that that was not what other people would do.
Okay. I now have a follow-up question because what I do, I feel like I know some people who are very extreme with those kinds of things. Like people come in and they make a very big deal about stopping what they're doing to kind of like,
Hmm.
now I'm kind of feeling like it's a script. Like they're like, nope, someone has entered. I need to go say hi to them.
Oh, it absolutely could be a script. Like, I feel like places where I mask, it does tend to be a little overcompensated and that it's very repetitive. So, I typically have a script where I say the same thing and I do it the same way
Yeah.
every time, down to the point where I've noticed, like, when I'm starting a telehealth call with a patient, I like clear my throat at the same point. I like make the same hand gesture. Like it's precisely the same every time.
So how
And
would
that was something
you,
that they asked about on the screening was about scripting. And I was like, no, I don't script. And then we were going to visit my husband's family, and I was talking in the car on the way there, like, okay, I can ask your brother about this. I can ask your mom this question. I'll ask this person this. And my husband was like, I think you're doing the scripting thing. I was like, wait a minute, you don't think ahead of time of like what you're going to talk to each person about before you go to a social event? I thought everyone did that. I've always done that because otherwise I wouldn't know what to ask.
yeah.
So that's an example where I caught myself scripting, like, oh, yes, I do actually plan ahead what I'm going to ask.
So I was going to ask you, how do you like how formally do you write like a script or think of a script for like so when you were saying that you call patients and you say the same thing every time, like is that something that's just kind of like just time after time you just feel like comfortable saying this one thing or do you actually like
I don't actually
write
have like a written script, it's just evolved out of repetition and routine. And like when I'm prepping questions, I think of them, I might say them out loud, but I don't like have them written on note cards per se. I tend to have a really good memory for just memorizing lots of stuff. And so if I plan some things ahead, I'll remember the questions. If I had a poor memory, I probably would write them on note cards, but I have a good enough memory that I don't have to do that.
yeah. Wow, I feel like a lot of people listening to this are going to like rethink how they are viewing the world because I think this is just really interesting going over, especially for just women. It's like so much of it just kind of gets dismissed, or they're like, I don't know, you got your little quirky things about you or something, where it's like, I don't know, where you were struggling so much from it, you ended up like getting an autoimmune, is it disorder? Is that what it's called? An
Yeah,
autoimmune
disease,
disease.
condition, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So like to be so like overwhelmed and stressed out that like to lead to so much burnout, like I feel like so many people would be able to relate to that because I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I
I
mean,
have
yeah,
I have a questionnaire that would be great for people who are listening thinking, am I masking? It's called the CAT-Q, CAT-Q, and it specifically asks questions about how much you camouflage and mask. And so
okay,
that can be a good one. Like if you take the autism screenings and score low, then take that one. And if you score really highly for masking, then it can make you rethink, okay, am I just masking traits?
yeah,
People who are neurodivergent in other ways also tend to score highly on the CAT-Q. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're masking autism. It just means you're masking something. Uh,
yeah,
but that's an interesting one. The other thing I wanted to say about burnout is I think a distinction that has been helpful for me to recognize is the degree that autistic burnout is so much more intense than kind of neurotypical occupational burnout. Because I've been telling people I'm burnt out, and I kind of get the response of like, oh yeah, parenting's hard. Take an hour break, go for a walk. Send your kid to daycare for the weekend and go camping for a weekend and you'll feel better. And really, the sort of burnout that I'm in is like right now I'm taking 3 weeks off of work and I'm sleeping like 6 hours a day and 10 hours a night, and then laying in bed the rest of the time in the dark.
yeah,
And that's about all that I can manage right now. And for the neurotypical people in my life, it took a long time for them to understand the degree of burnout. And I think I didn't catch it early because all of my other mom friends were like, oh, yeah, they're tired too. They're burnt out too. But then when we started talking about the details of like, what does that burnout feel like? I realized they're feeling a different degree of burnout than I am.
yeah.
A
It's
time
not
when
like
that really
2 minutes in your
clicked.
room can help.
Yeah, a thing that really clicked for me was when one day I was going for a walk and I kind of started fantasizing about getting run over by a bus and like, what if it broke my leg? And I had to like lay in a hospital bed for a month and they would just come take care of me and I would be like alone in the peace and quiet with like a shattered pelvis or something. And
Yeah,
that's not an unusual fantasy. Like I've had that fantasy at various points in my life when I'm going through a stressful period and I'm so burnt out that I'm like, I can't. I need a bus to run me over so I can take a break. And this was the first time that I was able to look at it through the autism lens and say, oh, this is trying to pretend that I'm not disabled when
yeah,
I am. And I could actually take a month off and lie in bed without having a shattered pelvis first.
yeah,
Hence taking the 3 weeks off work and lying in bed, not after being hit by a bus.
yeah,
Uh, but those are the sort of things that when I talk to neurotypical friends, they're just shocked. Like what? Why would you want that? I'm like, well, you've clearly never experienced the same degree of utter fatigue and burnout where getting hit by a bus feels like your best option.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
That is like that. It's also making me think a lot of like because I talk a lot about like get like having expectate like high expectations for students
mhm.
with disabilities, but it's also meeting them where they're at. And I mean, it's just like it's so hard because inclusion really looks different on everyone. Supporting a person looks different on everyone. But like for like no one should feel that they like can't ask for help or that like that they literally like to have that much burnout and not feel like they're able to like connect with someone who can like, tell you that I don't like confirm how you're feeling or something. Like that just must have been so hard. Okay.
Yeah, it has felt very lonely a lot of times. I think that's kind of a very dominant feeling in my life is feeling lonely. And autism has helped make sense of that
Yeah.
I feel like people don't understand me, but it's because they don't have the same neurotype and there are some experiences that I have that are not the same. And then finding the autism community, I'm like, oh, I have found people who get it when I'm like, I need to lay in bed for 3 months in the dark. And they're like, oh, yes, please do.
Yeah. So how is your husband or your partner, how have they taken this? Like, do you feel like they've been able to be supportive?
Hmm. Yeah, he's very supportive. He was initially a little bit skeptical because he had the same version of autism, awareness that a lot of us do of picturing sort of like a 7-year-old upper middle class white boy who lines up his play trains in, alphabetical order.
Yeah.
And and or people who are not able to hold a job or live on their own or maybe are nonverbal. And he had that stereotype in mind. And so he looked at me and was like, "You're too successful, basically, to be autistic." And then after learning more, then it was like, oh yeah, actually that does make sense. But there had to
Yeah.
be a little education process for both of us in learning more than just the, 1990s stereotype of autism.
Yeah.
And now he's been really supportive in trying to help determine which tasks put an unnecessary burden on me that he can do easily. So, for example, grocery shopping or running an errand for him is not a big deal. If I grocery shop, I'm going to be in bed the rest of the day. Like the grocery store is so overwhelming with sensory input, it is terrible. And so I don't grocery shop. We mainly have our groceries delivered, but if we need to run an errand, my husband does that or my mom does that. And those
Yeah.
are places where they can spend, 1 spoon of their energy that would have taken 10 spoons of my energy to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so we've been trying to divide tasks less down the equality line of like we're each going to do 50-50 of everything and more down the equity
Yeah.
line of like, okay, he's going to do the things that he's strong in, and I'll do the things that I'm strong in. And that's actually been a way of making an accommodation for myself is to try and offload some of the things that are hard for me to him, and vice versa. He's also neurodivergent, but not autistic, more on the ADHD side. And so there
Yeah.
are pieces with structure and planning and organization that are difficult for him that are really strong suits of mine. And
Yeah.
so, I take the tasks that are hard for him and he takes the tasks that are hard for me. And that works really well.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so great that you've been able to like find these accommodations and that you're sharing it all on a podcast. I mean and I just love that like you couldn't find it, so then you just created it. Like I think that is so important that I don't know, especially that we're in this creator world right now. I
Hmm.
just think it's so cool. So if you could you tell us one more time like what your podcast is called? I'm not quite sure you gave us the name.
Yes, it's called Parenting While Autistic.
Okay.
I wanted to make it clear that it's for parenting when you are autistic, not for parenting autistic children. It's on Spotify. I also put it on Apple Podcast and a few of the other podcast platforms. Um,
Okay.
I think I've put them on all the major platforms.
Cool. Well,
And
I'll
I
make
usually
sure to link
drop episodes
it.
on Fridays. I kind of have two formats that I do. I'm doing some interview episodes with other autistic parents and autistic therapists, and then doing some like little 5-minute mini episodes with a very specific parenting tip or trick that you could put into practice that week.
That's awesome. Well, I think that is super helpful. And I think a lot of my friends would really appreciate. I mean, do you think any of the tips that you share would also be beneficial for parents who either don't know that they're autistic yet or are neurotypical?
Yes, I think it would be helpful for anyone who's neurodivergent, anyone who has sensory sensitivities, or people who are just overwhelmed in general as parents, which you don't have to be neurodivergent to be overwhelmed
Yeah.
as a parent. Because a lot of them are about like, what are the little ways you can make your life easier? That you could consider autism accommodations, or you could just consider good life hacks to make your life easier.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
they could absolutely be applicable for everybody.
I feel like that's just how I feel a lot about so many practices that I've learned. I'm like, why doesn't everyone just do this? Like, this seems so much more beneficial. Feels like, I don't know, so many great things to learn. Well, I am going to put everything that we've talked about in the show notes so people can check out all those books we talked about, your podcast, the Cat Q questionnaire is that just like catq.com or If I Google like you, will I
If you
figure it
Google
out?
it, you'll find it. I like the website Embrace Autism. They have all the autism screening questionnaires in one place. And they also dive into like the statistics and the validity and accuracy of the different tests. And so again, it appeals to my autistic love of data and facts that they have all this background info on each test.
Yeah, that's
But
awesome.
that's a great
Okay.
site.
Well, I will put all of that down. Well, thank you so much, Lana, for being on this podcast. And I can't wait to check out your podcast more. And if you ever
Yeah,
want
thanks
to
for
hang
having me.
out, we're in the area. Oh, and I have my little slogan that I sign off with. So inclusion starts with you, and I just want to help. So thank you everyone for being here.